Hello and welcome to the UK column. I'm your host, Mike Robinson. Joining me today, I have Vanessa Beeley from Damascus and David Miller. David, welcome, and Vanessa, welcome to the program. We're going to get started off with talking about Israel and Zionism and so on. So, David, first question on my lips at the moment is, what is the Zionist movement, and what is the difference between the Zionist movement and the Zionist lobby?
Well, I mean, I think that there's been a lot of misunderstanding about what people usually call the Israel lobby and the broader Zionist movement, which is what I tend to bang on about quite a lot. And I think it's really very important for us to understand what the difference is between the Israel lobby and the Zionist movement. Now, the Israel lobby, easily defined, is all of those groups in Western countries, in the US, UK, France, or Germany, wherever else, who are engaged in attempting to influence policy, either domestic policy or foreign policy, in the interests of Zionism, or more specifically the regime in occupied Palestine, the Zionist regime. So that's organizations which might be in the political parties, like, for example, Conservative Friends of Israel or Labour Friends of Israel in the UK, or they might be think tanks like the neocon think tanks that there are in the UK, but Policy Exchange, the Henry Jackson Society, etc. Or they might be other kinds of lobby and influence groups like BICOM, for example, the Britain-Israel Communications and Research Centre, which is there to influence the media in favour of pro-Zionist narratives and talking points. Now, all of these organisations, one can say, are the Israel lobby, and we can also note other organisations like the Board of Deputies or the Jewish Leadership Council, which are all pro-Israel organizations or umbrellas. And everyone really would admit that those are organizations which are part of a lobby to pursue Zionist ideas. But when you talk about, and I should say, of course, that is the way in which the Israel lobby is conceptualized by almost everybody who's talked about it in the academic literature. In particular, most of it, obviously, Mearsheimer and Walt in their path-breaking book called the Israel lobby in 2005 or 6 or whatever it was. And that's the kind of definition they use. In the US, they have similar kinds of organizations, for example, the think tanks like the Foundation for Defense of Democracies or WINEP, or a whole range of others, or the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, and others, right? But there's something more to what I would call the Zionist movement than just those organizations. And if you look at Mearsheimer and Walt's book, for example, you find that the main Zionist organizations in the US are not in the index or only covered fleetingly. And I would sort of try and explain that by giving you an indication of what the Zionist movement is and how that relates to the lobby. So the Zionist movement is, of course, famously a movement set up at the end of the 19th century through an organization called the Zionist Organization. And they had big international conferences in Switzerland and in the UK and in other places, indeed in America as well, much later. And that organization became later on in the middle part of the last century the World Zionist Organization. So it's telling you something significant there. It's not just that it was a Zionist organization, it's now saying it's a World Zionist Organization. Now, of course, they don't have members in every country in the world. They have members in roughly 45 countries, but we can come back to that in more detail later. And associated with the Zionist movement, the aim of which was to set up a Jewish state in the historic territory of Mandate Palestine, were a series of other organizations. So the Zionist organization is at the top, the World Zionist Organization, and it has a number of other organizations which are there to help to construct the Zionist settler project. So, for example, they have the Jewish National Fund, which is there to expropriate, steal, buy land in Palestine for Jews to settle on, and only Jews. And then, of course, there's the Jewish Agency, which is a mechanism to try and secure Jews from outside Palestine and move them to become settler colonists in Palestine. And then there, of course, is the third organization, which makes up the four organizations which are at the head of the Zionist movement. The Keren Hazod, which was devoted to providing the money for doing all of those tasks. So there's four organizations which are at the peak of the Zionist organization, the World Zionist Organization and the Zionist movement, and they then have affiliate organizations in every country in which the Zionist movement is organized. So in order for there to be a Jewish state, they created this thing called the movement. They created the Jewish state, and then they decided, well, what shall we do? Should we dissolve the Zionist movement, or shall we keep it going? And of course, what they decided to do, as everybody knows, but nobody says, is that they decided to keep it going. And all of these organizations that I've been mentioning still exist. In fact, the headquarters of these organizations, the four organizations I've mentioned, are all in the same building in King David Street in Jerusalem, which they call National Institutions House, indicating that these are the national institutions of the so-called State of Israel. And of course, they have their branches everywhere else. In the UK, there is a Jewish National Fund UK, which is the branch, the UK branch of the Global Jewish National Fund, headquartered in Jerusalem. There is there's an office for the Jewish Agency. There is an organization called the United Jewish Israel Appeal, which is the fundraising organization, which is the UK branch of the Keren Hazod. And of course, there is a Zionist Federation, which is the formal UK affiliate of the World Zionist Organization, and it has amongst its members some 40 other formally Zionist organizations. Now, all of that, I've given you. I tried to be short with my description of it. All of that is the formal Zionist movement, all of which are formally linked to the World Zionist Organization by membership. Now, if you look at Mearsheimer and Walt's book, none of that's in there. It just simply doesn't appear. Now, why is that important? Well, it's important because these parts of the Zionist movement, which are, of course, allied with and work directly with the so-called Israel lobby, are also engaged in pursuing other functions. Now, I've already mentioned what those functions are: stealing the Palestinian land, settling people on that land, providing the money to do it. But as part of that, they have to do a range of other things in the countries outside Palestine where they operate. And amongst the things that they have to do is that they have to radicalize Jewish children into believing that they have what they call a birthright to live on stolen land in Palestine. So that's why they have a whole range of institutions to do that. They have nurseries, nurseries that are Zionist, schools. In the UK, the Jewish schools, many of them openly identify as being Zionist schools. Truly incredible. Should be illegal, and it doesn't happen for any other religion, but that's the truth. And then they have a whole range of youth groups. They have left-wing Zionist youth groups and right-wing Zionist youth groups and religious Zionist youth groups, and these are there to indoctrinate Jewish kids into believing that they've got a right to Palestine and that Palestinians are subhuman. And they, of course, take the kids off to their first trips, usually to occupied Palestine, when they're really quite young. I mean, 7, 8, 9, 10, the kids go on free trips to occupied Palestine. And the purpose is, of course, to indoctrinate them. And then, of course, later on, they have Zionist student groups, the Union of Jewish Students, Chabad on campus, Camera on campus, Stand With Us has activities on campus, a whole range of different Zionist student groups, again, which offer free trips to occupied Palestine, and which also provide a mechanism for young Jewish kids to be both indoctrinated and recruited into roles in occupied Palestine, either as settlers or, even more worryingly, as members of the occupation forces. And that's provided. Those routes are provided by the Union of Jewish Students, for example, which sounds on the surface just like a student body for Jewish kids. It's not. It's a genocidal Zionist organization. So that's the other functions of the Zionist movement, which are not really part of what you would call the Israel lobby. So the Israel lobby is part of the Zionist movement, but the Zionist movement is quite a lot bigger than that. And we have to understand that because there's such a lot more going on than just the question of the Israel lobby.
Vanessa, that's quite an incredible description that David has just given of an organization that the vast majority of people have no concept of the scale of.
Yeah, and I think what's kind of fascinating is the description that David has given is also very focused on, as you said, Jewish youth that can have this kind of aura of credibility and acceptability. But to what extent, I guess we have to look at to what extent that bleeds out from those Jewish movements into sectors of UK, we're focusing on UK, but also US society. To what extent does that then influence the thinking within UK society regarding the Palestinian issue or regarding the history of the Palestinian issue?
Yes. David, something that you said there that I wanted to get some more thoughts on was you said that no other religious group has this kind of infrastructure with respect to schools and so on. What is the situation? Because lots of people in the UK will be looking at the Islamic community in the UK and saying, well, they've got their own courts and they've got their own educational establishments of some kinds. But what's the relative scale of the infrastructure there?
So, I mean, the difference, of course, is that under UK law, it's perfectly permissible to have faith schools, to have Muslim schools, Jewish schools, Hindu schools, Sikh schools, indeed, of course, Catholic and Protestant schools. I mean, I went to what was called in Scotland when I was a kid a non-denominational school, which people think means any kind of Christian, but no, it's not. It's any kind of Protestant. And so, you know, even though these are sort of secular schools in a way, they're still religious schools in some respects. But of course, that's the law in the UK. But when we talk about Zionist schools, we're not talking about teaching Judaism or observance of Judaism or in the other examples, other religions. We're talking about commitment to a specific political ideology. Now, if we had schools in the UK which claimed to be Salafist or Wahhabist, then people would have an issue with that. They would say, that's not right. That's not Islam. That's a particular kind of Islam, which is a political movement. And I would say, yes, that's right. But we have got Zionist schools. Now, in the case of the UK, there I think are 170 Jewish schools in the country. I don't know how many of those are avowedly Zionist. It's very difficult to tell, but there are quite a number which are avowedly Zionist. A number have been set up by, for example, the United Synagogue, which is a synagogue movement, which again is avowedly Zionist. So you see the way in which this works. That there's a process whereby the idea of something being Zionist is represented as being completely normal, and this is what every Jew thinks. And of course, we know that's not true, but that's how they represent it. And this has been allowed in our society to flourish as something which is normal and which people don't even conceive of is actually happening. So there's about 170 of these schools. But the other thing I would say is that when you say people don't have any real idea about this, I think that's true, but the scale of it is way larger than I've already described. What I've described is effectively the core of the Zionist movement. And Vanessa was talking there about how it bleeds into the rest of the society. And I think that's a really very, very important question. If I maybe say a couple of things about how I think that happens, and then we can get into particular details. So obviously there are those elements of the lobby which are attempting to persuade, bully, intimidate, indoctrinate, or pay for other parts of the society to do what they want. And the most obvious place that happens, of course, is in Parliament, where, as we see today, the election is happening today. I don't know if we're broadcasting this today, but the election is on today, and there are some 170 or 180 MPs currently in Parliament, although they're not technically in Parliament anymore, who have taken money from the Israel lobby, and mostly, of course, from Labour Friends of Israel and Conservative Friends of Israel, but also from particular Zionist donors like Trevor Chin, who has been the effective head of the Zionist movement in the UK for some 20 or 30 years, and many other Zionist donors whose names have been banging about on Twitter or X in the last few weeks. And the people who are in receipt of this money are largely not Jewish, and they quite often can become what might be called career Zionists. So they're recruited usually at a young age when they're at university. So the Jewish Zionists are recruited effectively at primary and secondary school, whereas the non-Jewish career Zionists tend to be recruited through the National Union of Students and through the student movement. And you can see examples of these all over political life. Luke Akehurst is a very famous one who's standing for the seat in North Durham. John Woodcock, Lord Walney, as he's called now, the government's advisor on extremism. John Mann, again, another government advisor who's now in the Lords, and a whole range of others. Joan Ryan, for example, who was the head of Labour Friends of Israel, all non-Jewish career Zionists who are inculcated into the ideology with the help of money. Yes, quite often, not always. I mean, Luke Akehurst appears as not. I mean, obviously he works full time for the Israel lobby and is paid by the Israel lobby for his work. But I mean, there's a famous clip of him on Twitter where he says, I often wondered why they didn't take me to Israel on a free trip. And he says that Jeremy Newmark of the JLC said to him, well, we didn't need to take you, Luke. You were already convinced. We only wanted to take the people who we needed to convince. And that's how it works, right? So there's the career Zionist. And that, of course, is a very important way in which Zionist ideas trickle out into the body politic and other parts of society. But then there's a whole series of other activities. So I mean, I would put under one umbrella, for example, intelligence activities. So, obviously the Mossad carries out activities here, and it was in charge in the 1980s, for example, of the idea that anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism were the same, and it was in charge of a process which led to and it eventually became the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance working definition of anti-Semitism, lodged at the IHRA in 2016 and used as the main weapon against Jeremy Corbyn and against, indeed, all of the pro-Palestine movement all over the world. So the intelligence operation of Mossad is really quite interesting and sophisticated, and people don't really have any conception of that. And I can tell you some details of that if you want to. But the other element of the intelligence operation is especially associated with Unit 8200, which is the Signals Intelligence Unit of the Israeli military, the equivalent of GCHQ in the UK or the National Security Agency in the US. And one of its strategies in the last 20 years has been to invest heavily in its staff or ex-staff doing tech startups. So that, for example, in the UK, there are something like 400 Israeli tech startups. Now, these people are people who are engaged in contracts and all sorts of tech work, which brings them into contact with agencies of the British government and with other data which might have a potential use to Israeli intelligence. Now, we don't have clear evidence of the way that has been directly used by the Israeli regime, but it's perfectly apparent that there are many Israeli companies stuffed full of ex-Unit 8200 veterans who are working directly in contracts where they have access to data which is of national security importance. For example, with the Foreign Office, where, of course, the two major other intelligence agencies in the UK are based, with the Ministry of Defence, with the National Health Service, etc. And that's, of course, in addition to all of the tech firms who have access to, who are selling hacking software, the NSO Group, of course, famously advised by Cherie Blair, Celebrite, a whole range of other companies which we've discussed and exposed on our show, Palestine Declassified. And that's a really very important element of what you might call a broader Zionist movement, which is Israeli intelligence operations in this country, which are having a significant effect. And so there's the career Zionists, there's the Israeli intelligence operatives, and then, of course, there's a way in which this recruitment into the Zionist ideology then works its way through the political system, so that people who well, not just the political system, but the economic, political, and cultural system of this country, so that later on, people who have gone through that training end up in significant positions in, for example, politics, in government, in Whitehall, as civil servants, in economics and in finance, and indeed in the cultural industries as well. And that, of course, is helped along by the fact that Jews are overrepresented in relation to their per head of population in the UK and indeed in the US and other places too, in in economics, in politics, in journalism, in the civil service, in fact. Jews are massively, and of course, comparatively, Muslims are by far the worst in terms of their representation in the population. The British population has 0.5% Jews, and it has 6.5% Muslims. And so you can see that when you come to look at the figures, that the huge disparity that there is there. So there's a kind of an advantage which Jews have because of historical processes or whatever is the reason, which means that these Zionist ideas, because of course most Jews overwhelmingly are Zionist. We don't know the exact figures; it depends how you count them. But between 60 and 95%, the ultra Zionists would say 95%, probably somewhere in between. So when you have an advanced class, Jews are by and large average, wealthier, to have higher take-home pay than does anyone else, including white people. Then what you have is an advantaged level of access to decision-making for Zionists. And that's what you find time and again. That's partly why you find, for example, in the national security and extremism field, neoconservative institutions with a high proportion of people who are from a Jewish Zionist background, pushing forward policies in the UK, which are in whose interest which is in Israel's interest, as opposed to necessarily just clearly British or British imperial interests, however one might want to categorize them. So that's part of the other element of the power of the Zionists is the threading through the fabric of society of people who have what should we say, a genocidal ideology, a fundamentally racist genocidal ideology, who are not fit to be in public service, any of them. But nevertheless, we don't have any real language or a way of discussing that or thinking about that, which could lead to a process of de-radicalization, de-Zionization, and the dismantling of the Zionist movement, which we clearly have to do, since it shows no signs of wanting to make nice with the Palestinians or indeed with anyone else.
Vanessa, you got any comments or thoughts on that or questions?
No, I mean, I think, the more that David and I have talked about this, the more you look into it, the more horrifying it actually is, the extent to which their reach, the reach of the Zionist movement has expanded into every single sector. We're focusing on British society. I mean, I keep telling people, look at the 2030 roadmap between Israel and the UK to fully understand the extent of reach that the Zionists have in every single sector of British society. And I guess really what maybe we need to help people understand, because, they may still be saying, well, okay, but, you can just say this is a tech development partnership. How is this going to affect the ordinary person in the UK in the future? I mean, for me, it's clear we're being actually infiltrated by, as David described it, it's a genocidal, supremacist, racist ideology that is incentivizing those that control the decisions that affect our life into either believing in that ideology or at least supporting it for their own gain, let's say. So I guess for me, it's an important thing for people to fully understand to what extent this is going to affect us. Well, not me, I'm in Syria, but I mean the ordinary person in the UK.
Let me ask you this question, and then we'll get David's thoughts on it if we could. What are we looking at here? Are we looking at Israel as a British project? And in fact, the entire Zionist movement is an outgrowth of British imperialism, or are we looking at a British project which has effectively gone rogue and is starting to take over British institutions again?
Well, I think that's a kind of a circular discussion question, because it's a very difficult one to answer. I tend to see it that Israel was a settler colonial project that was basically, sorry, the electricity just came back on, that was kind of midwifed by the British, but the British were heavily incentivized to do so. Then, obviously, the entire movement has to a large degree been adopted by the United States to further its own neocolonialist agenda in the region. And to me, sometimes it appears that it was Britain's Frankenstein that has turned into an uncontrollable monster, and that the monster, to some degree now, is consuming the society that created it in the first place. That's to a large degree how I do see it, but at the same time, I can flip it and say that the ideology of the Zionists is not far from the British imperialist ideology also. So as I said, it's a very sort of, I'd be really interested in David's point of view on this.
Okay, so I mean, I think that when you ask these kind of questions, I mean, people tend to ask these questions just in relation to Israel and Palestine, or the influence of Zionism. But I think, let's look at the parallels first of all. What are the parallels that happened in other settler colonial situations? I'm thinking of Algeria, of South Africa, of Northern Ireland, of Rhodesia, and now, of course, called Zimbabwe. And let's start with Zimbabwe. I mean, let's remember, Ian Smith declared UDI from Britain, Universal Declaration of Independence. And of course, that's an indication, isn't it, that settlers can go rogue. And indeed, I would go further than that. I would say that settlers always go rogue. It's the condition of settlers to have separate interests than the metropolis. And that was the case with the Orange Order and the Loyalists in the north of Ireland, remains the case. That was the case with the Pied Noir in France, in Algeria. It was the case with the Boers, and indeed with the white settlers in South Africa. And it is the case in Palestine. So that's the first thing, is to say that they always go rogue. And that's in the DNA of the settler, because a settler colonial situation has its own material circumstances. I get a lot of stuff from socialist groups who say, "Oh, you don't understand the material relations," and I'm saying, because they want me to talk about class, and say, "Well, of course, the solution to Israel-Palestine is a socialist revolution in the whole of West Asia." And I say, "Well, guys, it's not only about class. The settler colonialism has its own material basis." And that on the basis is that the interests of the settlers diverge from the interests of the metropolis. It's perfectly clear that that's always what happens. But let's come to the precise example. So, yes, it was a British project. Yes, there was lobbying to set that British project up from the Zionist movement. And of course, Ilan Pappy's new book on this is out now, and you can all go and read that, and we can talk about the extent to which the Christian Zionists formed the Jewish Zionism, and all of those kind of questions. But I think that's a longer debate. Let's not have that just now. But what you see with the creation of the State of Israel is an almost immediate divergence, don't you, between the interests of colonial Britain and the interests of the settler colonists. And that's why, of course, the Haganah, and indeed the Lehi, the Stern Gang, and the Irgun started to kill British soldiers and hang them with piano wire and booby trap their bodies, and bomb the Colonial Club in London, and excavate a copy of Shakespeare's plays and send it as the first ever book bomb in the history of terrorism to the brother, by mistake, of a British serviceman. And that divergence was already happening then. And when those two soldiers were strung up with piano wire, there were what is called anti-Jewish riots in this country, in Glasgow. In fact, in the Gorbals in Glasgow, in the area where my dad at that stage lived, where there was the Jewish population mainly lived in the Gorbals then. They moved out later, of course. And so you see that divergence. Now, the divergence wasn't necessarily a fundamental divergence, but it did mark the views of the ruling class in this country quite notably. And that's why, of course, Margaret Thatcher famously refused to shake Menachem Begin's hand when he came to visit Downing Street, because he was, in her view, a terrorist. And these are real things that happened, that divergence. But the divergence wasn't a straightforward process. It didn't proceed in one direction. Let's remember in 1956, the British collaborated in secret with the French and the Zionists to invade Suez. And of course, that was a debacle heralding the end of British imperialism or the British Empire to a large degree. But then when we come up later, we see that there have been continued divergences. Although the UK and the US have been supportive of Israel, the US more so, that's not stopped Mossad from operating against Britain and against the interests of Britain. So, for example, when the Mossad ran an operation using Palestinian informers to execute Naji al-Ali, the famous Palestinian cartoonist who's famous for Hamdallah, the wee cartoon boy. He was executed in Kensington in 1987, and Thatcher shut down the Mossad cell in London, expelled them all. Now, who would have thought that a person of the kind of politics of Margaret Thatcher would have done that? Of course, even later on, when David Miliband was Foreign Secretary, in the famous incident where the Mossad used forged passports, fake British passports, to execute a Custom Brigade's commander in Dubai, and David Miliband, as a Zionist, expelled Mossad as a result of that. So you can see that there are ways in which their interests are not always similar and sometimes diverge. And even that started really very, very early. I mean, Mossad had an agent inside the National Security Council of Britain in the late 1940s. And this was discovered by MI5, and the person was removed. And the MI5 files now declassified, where the MI5 case officer writes up the notes and says, "Oh, now we understand that is hostile power." In 19, okay, so that this is not a straightforward thing, and that hostility that there was between the security establishment and the Zionists has dissipated, yes, to some extent, but it hasn't meant that Zionists aren't targeting this country to pursue the interests of Zionism. Like, let me finish. I'm sorry I've been going on a bit long, but it's necessary, I think, to talk about some of these issues. So what does that mean now? Well, I think Vanessa's phrase, that going rogue, is very apt. I mean, what we see with the Zionist project is not just an attempt to get a homeland for the Jews, and then they'll be happy, and then everything can go back to normal, as if that could have happened after a Nakba, etc. But imagine that could have happened. But that's not what they want. They want regional hegemony, and they want to do that through the pursuit of Israel, to take as Menachem Begin talked about it in the late 1960s, early 1970s, to take Egypt and part of Lebanon and the West Bank and part of Jordan, etc., etc. And of course, what they want is a wider hegemony where they will have a greater Israel, and they will become, to some extent they already are, an imperialist power in their own right. And I think that's one thing which people on the left who want to say tail doesn't wag the dog don't appreciate, that that there was a time when Britain was the unrivaled global hegemon, and that's not the case anymore. So how did that happen? There's a historical process whereby hegemons replace each other in the kind of Western process, where it's been the UK and then the US, and Israel is trying to become a junior imperial power of its own. Now, of course, in the context of BRICS and multipolarity, that's unlikely to be successful, but that's their aim. And so I think we should start to think about this idea that the tail doesn't wag the dog, that they must be doing what the Americans want. It is not correct. I mean, as we've said, settlers always go rogue, and there have been few, if I might say this, as rogue as the Zionists.
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to come back on the 8200 in a few minutes, but before I do that, David, I may have asked you this the last time we spoke, but I'd like to cover it again if we didn't cover it, if we have covered it before, and that is, what was the process of getting from the point where we had the, Mossad being expelled by Thatcher and Miliband? How did we get from that point to the point that we are today, where the British government is, totally in bed with Zionism?
Well, I would say that they're not necessarily totally in bed. There are still elements of the security establishment who are skeptical. I mean, I don't know them personally. I couldn't give you their names, but I'm convinced that they don't speak to me much, but I'm convinced that they are. So, but they're certainly not the dominant fraction of the security establishment. Now, how did we get there? Well, I think we got there by, there was a process whereby, if you look back at the way in which we now think about political violence, where for political elites in this country and almost every other Western country, the main threat that we face in terms of political violence is Islamic extremism and Islamic terrorism, or Islamism, a word which is simply invented or a new meaning of it was invented in about 1979, 1980. The term Islamist in English had never been used before in the history of the English language. The term Islamism used to mean someone who studies Islam, but now it means someone who is an advocate of political Islam, which is a uniquely and necessarily awful kind of threat to civilization, etc. Even if it's the case that in certain circumstances, British and American intelligence might want to use Islamists to pursue their own foreign policy agendas, such as Vanessa knows only too well in Damascus, in Libya, etc., and other places. But let's leave that to aside for 1 minute. So, where did these terms come from? Why do we have the term Islamist? Where does the idea of Islamic terrorism come from? And it may or may not surprise you to know that they come from, effectively, with a little bit of help from the CIA, they come from Zionist intellectuals and from the Zionist movement. And let me tell you exactly. The term Islamist is invented essentially by some writers, some Zionist writers. Bernard Lewis, for example, his mentee Martin Kramer, the so-called Gang of Four of Islamophobic pro-Zionist scholars who are around Lewis, and you can chart the way in which this term has been used. We've got a page on our website Powerbase on the term Islamism, Islamist, and you can see exactly who started using it when. Of course, there were some French scholars who started to use it around about 79, 80 in relation to Afghanistan, in relation to the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, in relation to other areas as well. And some of those French scholars, it transpires, had some sort of relationship with the CIA. But it's largely from Zionist scholars, and in particular, the almost really incredible single point of origin of both the question of Islamism and Islamist, and indeed Islamic terrorism, is a conference held in Washington, D.C. In 1984, towards the end of the first Reagan presidency. And it was organized by a think tank called the Jonathan Institute, named after the brother of Benjamin Netanyahu. And who ran the conference? Benjamin Netanyahu himself. He edited the book which came out of it. And it was there, they had a previous conference in 79 in Jerusalem, where the term Islamic terrorism wasn't really used. There was a very, very brief discussion of it, like in a tiny paragraph of one of the contributions. In 84, you have a whole panel on Islamic terrorism, chaired by Bernard Lewis and the other three members of the Gang of Four. I forget their names exactly, but each one of them more Islamophobic than the last. And that's where the term comes from. And you can see, again, I put this on the website, the way in which the term Islamic terrorism replaces, or Islamic or Islamist terrorism, in books in English on it. You can do a Google Ngram on this. Anyone could check out the data. Replaces other sorts of terms. So the term communist terrorism is a term which is used quite regularly in books in English from about 1944, starting, I would guess, with the operation in Greece against the left in Greece, and communist terrorism becomes a term which falls out of use in around about 1975, 1980. At which point the term Irish terrorism becomes much more important. Now, in the graph, they sort of flow along and they replace each other. But by the time you get to the 1990s, the term Islamist terrorism and Islamic terrorism really massively take off in books in English. And you're seeing a change in the way in which we think about political violence. And that change comes not straightforwardly, not by a decree being issued by the then Israeli government, but by a process whereby the Zionists conquered the national security infrastructure of the US and the UK. And that's why we have today the kinds of policies we have on extremism. That's why we have someone like Lord Wolney doing his extremism review just the other day. I mean, he's a career Zionist, or why we have the Centre for what's it called, the Commission for Countering Extremism. That's why we have Michael Gove. That's why we have the new extremism policy. I'll finish on that. The new extremism policy introduced by Michael Gove just a couple of months ago. We did a show on this. And where does it come from? Well, it starts off life as a report by the Policy Exchange, set up by Michael Gove. And then the findings from this are taken up by the independent reviewer of terrorism and extremism, who is a guy called Lord Shawcross, who takes up the post from his previous post at the Policy Exchange. And then he gives the report to Michael Gove, Policy Exchange, who introduces the report more or less straight into law. That's how it works. This is and who is it that funds the Policy Exchange? Big surprise. It's Zionist family foundations, and these are the main funders of the Policy Exchange, especially its work on Islam. Just like they're the main funders of the Henry Jackson Society. So what we see here is a process which operates, below everyone's sight line, out of radar contact, but which nevertheless, when you look at it, actually occurs.
Okay, that is spectacular. I was going to go straight on to 8200 at this point, but before we do, because this raises another question for you, David, and that is if we look at so-called right-wing extremism, so-called white nationalism, and we go back to the 1980s and the 1990s, even into the early 2000s. Anti-Semitism was a part of that. In however you define anti-Semitism, that was a part of that, and somehow the right wing has fallen in love with Zionism. And I'd be interested if you've got any insight into the process by which that happened, and was it linked to what we just discussed with respect to government?
I mean, this is the thing. When you start to look at this stuff, I like to say this because I'm sure it annoys the Zionists, but if I hadn't been sacked by the University of Bristol and been able to spend almost all of my time investigating Zionism, I would never have found out half of this stuff. But when you start to look at it, it's too extraordinary. I really had no idea of the kind of length, the range and the depth of the power of the Zionist movement. I really had no idea. I talked about the Zionist movement quite a lot, but I was only in the foothills of understanding. I believe I still am. So how does this happen? Yes, the right across the whole of the European continent abandons anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism disappears really as a form of racism in this period. And they instead take up Zionism with Tommy Robinson and Geert Wilders and all of the rest of them, who become Judeophiles, who become pro-Zionists. Not all of them, but quite a lot of them. And that's significant. And I think that's part of the reason why we see the decline and more or less extinction of anti-Semitism as a form of racism in the UK today. And I got criticised for saying this by a number of people on the left, including the SWP, whose only comeback was to say, but look, Viktor Orban in Hungary, and I give you the point, right? You can have that point. But where is the anti-Semitism as a form of racism in Britain today, where Jews are racialized, where the physiognomy is discussed, where their inherent greed and all of the things which are associated with the racialization of Jews? It doesn't exist anymore. And part of the reason for that, I think, is that the society's moved on, and that and I would say, if you look at the definitions of racism in the dictionary, all the definitions have some reference to the fact that to be racism, it has to be structural, it has to be institutional, it has to be a structure. And the forms of racism we find in society today are racism against Muslims, against black people, yes, of course, as has been the case for many years. In the 70s and 80s, racism against the Irish. And that's because these were state-directed projects, directed by the police, the counterintelligence, the counterinsurgency industry, the counterterrorism establishment. But the thing that I found more surprising is to look at the way in which the anti-racist movement in this country developed. So for most of the period since the 1940s, the anti-racist movement has focused, by and large, on the question of anti-fascism when it's dealing with racism. And that, of course, has been a way of saying that the main problem, even if people didn't believe this, the main problem of racism in this country is fascism. And actually, it's not. The main problem in racism in this country is racism against black people and Muslims, enacted by largely the state. Yes, of course, we've got people on the streets and street armies, etc. But it's the state which does that. And I think the focusing of the attention on anti-fascism allowed there also to be a sort of solidarity of anti-racisms encompassing the Jews as well. But of course, that was done at a price, and the price was that we didn't focus on the main forms of racism. We didn't focus on institutional racism. There's only really been one major anti-racist organization in this country, as far as I'm aware, the Anti-Racist Alliance, led by Mark Wadsworth, which focused on institutional racism and state racism, which of course are the main types. And that part of the reason for that is the influence of the Zionist movement on the anti-racist movement. And that sounds like an extraordinary thing to say. Let me just give you a couple of examples. So one of the earliest anti-fascist groups in this country was the 43 group, which is a group of largely Jewish ex-servicemen coming back from the Second World War, determined to fight fascism in Britain. Large numbers of them were communists, members of the Communist Party of Great Britain specifically, and they fought fascism on the streets of London. There's a a drama called Ridley Road by the BBC on it. I did a review of it. But what was unbelievable when I started to research that was that actually what was going on here was that although they tried to keep Zionism out of the organisation, it was and became a Zionist organisation, and such that not only did it allow its members to join the Nakba and to fight with the Haganah and indeed with the Irgun and the Stern Gang, but it also, en bloc, affiliated to the Irgun in 1948. And so this anti-fascist group was affiliated to the Irgun, the revisionist Zionist terrorist organization. And that, when I started to realize that, and I started to trace through all of the other groups which came out of that, so the 62 group, the Group Relations Educational Trust, Jacob, etc., the same people were on Searchlight. Same people were all in these organizations. They set up a whole range of other groups, which I think it's fair to call Zionist anti-racist groups. And so, in particular, Searchlight, it was headed by a guy called Jerry Gable, who was the director of intelligence for the 62 group, and his director of finance in the 62 group was a guy called Gerald Ronson, who, of course, the famous Guinness fraudster, who went on to set up the Community Security Trust, the key organization in this country, blurring the distinction between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. And so that there we have a whole trajectory of Zionist organizations, and the trajectory from Searchlight, which was very close to British intelligence and to the Special Branch, is that they set up an organization out of Searchlight called Hope Not Hate, currently trying to sabotage alternative candidates in the British election, including from especially on the left. So that's the whole trajectory of Zionist groups. Sorry to go on, but just briefly then, how does that affect the other anti-racist groups that people will know about? The Rock Against Racism, Anti-Nazi League, Out Against Fascism, Stand Up to Racism. Well, I would say how it affects them is that these groups were compromised by having relationships with, and indeed having on their governing boards, people from the Zionist organizations. So, for example, Searchlight had two people, Jerry Gable and another guy from Searchlight, on the board of the Anti-Nazi League from the beginning. And that, of course, meant that they didn't want to focus on structural racism. They didn't want to focus on questions of class. They wanted to focus instead on anti-fascism, which was not, even then, the main threat that people of colour faced in this country. And so that, I think, is part of an explanation for the question you've got. And there's one more thing I would say, which is that these far-right groups which abandoned anti-Semitism and took up Islamophobia, it wasn't just that they did that because that's what the state was doing. It's also because it's what the Zionists were doing and what the Zionists wanted them to do. So when you look at who is it that funds Geert Wilders in the Netherlands? Who is it that has funded Tommy Robinson, Stephen Yaxley Lennon? Who is it that has funded Katie Hopkins? And when you look, you see, it's the Middle East Forum in the US, or it's the Shillman Foundation, or it's the David Horowitz Freedom Center, all of which are Islamophobic organizations funded by the Zionists. And that's truly mind-blowing when you start to realize that the far right is being bankrolled by the Zionist movement as well. And people have no idea of that, really.
Wow.
Vanessa.
I'm speechless. I think, David, please write a book very soon, because this information is kind of, I mean, like you said, I'm very much at the foothills. You've just possibly elevated me considerably higher just in 1 hour. So please write a book as soon as possible, because this is so important for people to understand how they're being manipulated by the Zionist movement. It's extraordinary.
Okay, well, look, we're running out of time, but before we go, let's talk a little bit more about Unit 8200, because as you said, David, Vanessa and I have covered this in recent weeks on the UK Column News. My point about this has been, we have seen the British establishment banning Huawei, for example, from taking part in commercial activities in the UK because of the risk to national security of Huawei telecoms kit on 5G networks and telecoms networks. At the same time, we have, Unit 5200 or 8200 backed organizations. We've got Checkpoint. We've got Juniper Network, Oracle. A whole bunch of networks organizations. Oracle, which is basically running every government database that's in existence, and these are all spawned from the Israeli equivalent of GCHQ, which is all about signals intelligence. And if you are a signals intelligence organization and you're spawning commercial organizations which are capable of producing gear which is capable of gathering bulk data, which is the whole basis of signals intelligence, it's not a coincidence that they are building these types of organizations. So why are the British people not shouting about that and the dangers of that with respect to national security and our personal security, in fact?
Well, the why question is a difficult question, but I mean, look, there's no equivalent of the Zionist penetration of the tech industry. France isn't doing it. Tanzania isn't doing it. South Africa's not doing it. Algeria's not doing it. The Chinese aren't even doing it. I mean, the idea that the Chinese Communist Party runs TikTok or Huawei is some kind of major threat. I mean, it's ridiculous. But that, of course, is part of the propaganda, isn't it? The threats that we face are from China, from Russia, from Iran, not from Israel. We cannot talk about that. We cannot mention that. We cannot even conceive that is the case. But of course, the main threat is from Israel, because it's the one which is, empirically speaking, active in trying to penetrate our systems. Larry Ellison, who runs Oracle, who, as you said, runs the databases for national security relevant databases for the Home Office, the Foreign Office, the MOD, and the National Health Service. I mean, people have got to be out of their minds if they think that this is not an actual national security problem. Even the national security establishment knows that it's a problem. And you can see that because, of course, they investigated Patrick Drahi. Are you familiar with him?
No.
Who now owns a large proportion of British Telecom. And he runs, of course, I-24 News in occupied Palestine. And he bought up the famous French radical newspaper Libération. And he appointed as editor to that newspaper someone who was a veteran of where?
8200.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, God.
But they investigated him for national security. And now, of course, they didn't announce what the reason was, but that's the reason, right? And I mean, they have people in there who can see that this is an issue But obviously, there are also people in there saying, keep it dark, old boy. We don't want to do this. And so that allows the penetration. I mean, Ellison is a fanatical Zionist. Wasn't it him who just happened to have in his back pocket $1 billion to lend to Elon Musk to buy Twitter? Isn't that what happened? I think that's what happened.
Yeah, pretty much.
and so you've got a genuine problem. I mean, I see that Scottish Palestine Solidarity are trying to raise the issue of the company which runs the surveillance technology in Glasgow city centre, and for the Garda Síochána in Dublin, and that's an Israeli intelligence-linked firm as well, and Authentics, which is the one which is now checking the identities of everyone who's got a Twitter account with the blue check plus the premium plus on Twitter. That's a Israeli company. And the idea that this is not a problem, and then the idea that the NSO group, which has done all this hacking software, which sells it to the Saudis and to the UAE and to repressive governments everywhere, and of course the Israelis remain with a back door into the data gathered by these other countries. So when the Saudis are cracking down on the dissidents, Israel has a window on what's happening. And do we imagine they're not using that window? Well, of course they are. I mean, this is absolutely absurd, and people have no conception of that. And we do need to raise our game here and properly explain how this works and why it's an issue.
Vanessa, thoughts?
I agree 100%. I think it's very important for people to understand how this infiltration is going to affect our daily lives, whether it's on social media, whether it's in the health sector, whether it's in suddenly our personal information turns up somewhere in Israel and is being used for nefarious purposes. I think it's incredibly important for people to fully understand the extent to which Israel is, are we living in the UK or are we living in Little Israel? I mean, that's basically what it's coming down to now. Are our politicians working and representing us, or are they representing Israel?
Yes, and I mean, Vanessa, it's, with all these companies that are being incubated by Israel and Israeli intelligence, then of course there are jobs that are dependent on that incubation, and so people's loyalty is effectively bought on a much broader basis.
Yeah, absolutely.
Just one final question, David. You talked about Powerbase and you talked about Palestine Declassified. Just tell us a little bit more about Powerbase, because it is a fantastic resource, and tell us how people can find that.
Okay, so in 2004 or 5, as a result of the propaganda over Iraq and also the question of lobbying and corporate power in the UK, me and some colleagues set up a company called Public Interest Investigations, and it has 2 projects. One is Spinwatch, the website spinwatch.org, which has reporting and reports, and the other one is a wiki site called Powerbase, which has, tens of thousands of pages on it, which tries to profile individuals and organizations engaged in public debate and show, where they get their money from, who they're linked to, et cetera, and that's an ongoing project which, it is useful. Some of the pages are out of date. It needs a lot more investment and research, but it's a useful way of trying to keep tabs on some of this. Palestine Declassified is the TV show which I produce and I'm the regular commentator on, which is now produced twice a week. It's on Press TV, which is the Iranian government's English language service, and which is available, we're banned from YouTube, but which is available on X, on Facebook, on Rumble, and I think we've got an Instagram page as well now.
Telegram.
Oh, there's a Telegram. So there is, yes. Telegram channel is probably the best one. So so that's there, and we're P declassified on Twitter and similar on the other social media, and you can follow us there. We do investigations twice a week now, and you get stuff there that you more or less don't get anywhere else.
Yeah. Okay. Brilliant. And I think the web address for Powerbase is powerbase.info, isn't it? I think that's it.
That's right.
Okay, well, look, I think that's been a fascinating conversation, David. I would like to repeat this at some point in the not too distant future and delve in a little bit deeper. But I'm going to say thank you both for joining us today. That has been fascinating. And I'm just going to end by saying, when we were looking at the Israeli lobby money that was being paid to MPs, I'm sure it was not an exhaustive list. But you began this program by talking about Conservative Friends of Israel and Labour Friends of Israel. There were other Friends of Israel groups that I'd never heard of. I hadn't heard of Northern Ireland Friends of Israel, despite the fact that I was born and grew up in Northern Ireland, and a whole host of others that are just pumping, relatively small amounts of money. But of course, it all adds up if you're getting money from disparate groups. The number of Friends of Israel groups, we don't have Friends of Italy groups that I'm aware of on this kind of scale. So, people should be asking these questions. So look, we're going to leave it there for today. I'm going to say thank you very much to you both, and we'll see what the response is to this, and we will undoubtedly ask you both back in the not too distant future to delve a little bit deeper. So thank you both.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mike.